To the Point with your host, News Channel 5's Kelly Dunn.
When Tom Rooney first ran for Congress in 2008, he wasn't given much of a chance against incumbent Tim Mahoney. But with the help of a Mahoney sex scandal, Rooney was able to buck a Democratic tide.
You know, it's the whole spread the wealth mentality of Barack Obama and Tim Mahoney versus, you know, keeping government out of the way but keeping us safe with Senator McCain and Tom Rooney.
Rooney was easily reelected 2 years later. Most recently, he took on his own Republican leader, House Speaker John Boehner, and defeated Boehner's plan to build additional military jet engines that would have cost hundreds of millions of dollars.
The American people sent us here to change the way that Washington works.
Good morning and welcome to the Point. My guest today is Congressman Tom Rooney, a Republican from Tequesta, representing a congressional district that stretches from one side of the state to the other. And thank you very much, Congressman, for coming in today because of scheduling conflicts. I know it's the first time we've had you on To the Point, so we greatly appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me and thanks for your patience.
Oh, absolutely. And I know you're a little jet lagged, and we can understand why, because you were recently in Afghanistan. And let's get to the point. What's your opinion? Are we making progress against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda?
I think that we are, certainly with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is basically hunkered down and basically non-existent at this point in Afghanistan. The Taliban, you know, is going to be a much different story. We're building up their capacity for security. The key is to make sure that the local villages know that they can secure themselves against the Taliban. And don't make any mistake about it, they're sick of the Taliban too. So the problem is they're trying to hedge their bets to make sure that once we leave and we begin drawing down in July, that if the Taliban does come back in, they're not going to be punished for cooperating with us. So it's going to be difficult. Afghanistan's much different than Iraq. We were also there, and they had infrastructure, even though it was a dictatorship. And so their security forces are much further along than Afghanistan. With Petraeus now leaving Afghanistan, you know, it's questionable.
Was it the day after you left that it was the 8 Americans who were killed?
Right. It was a couple days after we left. There was an incident at the airport there, which we flew in and out of, and you know, apparently it was a Taliban person. I want to see what Karzai's response is to this guy. Certainly, you know, we're buying him time to get his act together, and with the corruption in his government, it's been very frustrating. And you know, we always hear that he's the best that we can do, and you know, that's fine. But we're buying him time with the lives of our kids, and it's time for him to step up in leadership. And there was five other soldiers killed when we were there by suicide bomber, and one Sergeant Linda Pierre from Naples, Florida. So it was very emotional.
Is it secure enough to begin drawing, you know, down those troops? I mean, can we safely do that?
When you got it, I think that you get to a point where it's, you know, you got to cut the cord and say, you know, it's now or never. We can't hold your hand any longer. And I think that maybe you could make the argument, we're not completely leaving in July. That's just when we begin on conditions on the ground. So, you know, certainly the Afghan National Army is much further along than the police force there, which is a different entity. But there's still a lot of corruption there. But the Afghan National Army is getting a lot better. That we're having a lot less people leave. We're actually getting selective of who we let into that Afghan National. Before, we were taking whoever would come. So it's getting a lot better. But the guy that killed the 8 people was one of their apparent, you know, people that we were training too. So that's what's frustrating.
Absolutely. When I told a friend that you were going to be our guest this week, she asked me to ask a question on behalf of her family and other military families. Her particular situation is that her son has been in the Army for 10 years. He and his family were stationed in Oklahoma. At that time, he and his wife bought a house. Well, he then has been deployed 3 times and is now at a base in Georgia. His family is still in Oklahoma because they cannot sell their house. And she was saying, you know, is there anything the government can do to reunite these families? They're being separated by not only the deployments, but by this housing market.
Yeah, they're probably at Fort Sill, the house there in Oklahoma. And when we were at Fort Hood, this was happening a lot in Texas. What people were doing was deploying the wives or husbands, depending, would end up moving back home wherever it was. And a lot of the soldiers that I served with would just end up renting their house out to other people. You know, you have you know, the VA loan and stuff to make it a lot easier for people like that were in the military to buy the house and try to rent it out. But there really isn't any other service provided by the government under the Soldier, Sailor, Civil Relief Act, which usually covers a lot of that stuff. But definitely tell your friend that I will look into that, because, you know, that's not the first I've heard of that. And certainly with these military bases kind of condensing into just a few, the infrastructure growing around them has been great. But there are a lot of people stuck with houses, just like everywhere else, though.
Right. Well, being on the House Armed Services Committee, I mean, are there other things being done? What else? What can you tell military families that you and your counterparts in Washington are working on right now to help families, military families?
Well, first and foremost, I mean, the big thing for us was to make sure that they were getting paid. And, you know, one of the fears that we had with the potential government shutdown was the president wasn't giving us any assurances, as President Clinton and President Reagan had done before, that if there is a government shutdown, this will not affect military families. This administration wasn't making that promise. So we were very nervous, and we got a lot of emails and Facebook, you know, posts that, you know, from friends, not only friends of mine, but people I never met before, that were saying, if I don't get paid, we're going to default on the mortgage back at Fort Sill or wherever, and this is going to be bad. So, you know, there was no way we could have that, and we didn't want to kind of play chicken with whether or not the president would cut those checks off. So, I mean, that's first and foremost, is to say that we respect what they're doing. We put them in harm's way. We have to take care of them and their families while they're there, and also while we get home. Other things that, you know, my office has taken the lead on. We're the head of the Invisible Wounds Caucus, which deals with post-traumatic stress disorder and severe brain injury. There was news that came out just yesterday that that those people that have, you know, specific diagnosis of severe brain injury are eligible for Purple Heart status, which has never been. It's hard to measure those kind of injuries, but, you know, certainly we've seen an increase in suicides in the military and former military. That, you know, it's just something that I couldn't ignore anymore. And so those are the type of things that hopefully, you know, we step up even as the rest of the budget contracts.
And you just presented some Blue Stars to some families on the Treasure Coast this week.
The Blue Star Award was a Treasure Coast idea that, you know, would give some closure, hopefully, to some of the parents that have lost loved ones in the service that were killed here rather than in a deployed setting.
Right.
And one was a pilot, died in a training accident. One Lieutenant Fletcher was actually murdered on Fort Hood, where I served, by another soldier. And, you know, a lot of time, and they're not eligible for Purple Heart. We wrote a letter to the Department of Defense asking them why and if they could be, and they said no. So Treasure Coast went ahead and did their own ceremony.
Yeah, it was very nice.
We presented them a flag flown over the Capitol, and I know that they appreciated it.
It certainly seemed like it, and I'm glad we were there to cover that day. Protesters, let's move on to Medicare and the Medicare cuts. A lot of protesters starting to show up at these town hall meetings. We saw it with Alan West, with Dan Webster. You know, are you having any coming up, and what are you anticipating?
As we're sitting here today, they're protesting my office. So if they're wondering where I am, this is my alibi. You're my alibi.
That's right. I'm your alibi today.
But they're there, and you know, this was sent out, I guess, a day or two ago, and to show up in my office and express their concern for Medicare. And look, I'm concerned about Medicare too. That's why what we signed up for, the Ryan budget, was to save Medicare. I'm 40 years old. You know, they say that that's sort of the cutoff age where they can't promise us anything, those people that are 40 and younger. So we're basically saying if you're 55 and older, this is not going to affect you. But those of us, you know, that are younger than 55, we have to change the way that the government provides this service, because the way that it's working now is going to go broke, and it's not going to be there for me, my kids, or our, you know, grandkids.
But how can we do that without severely hurting the people that rely on this so heavily and have for years?
Well, what we're going to do is basically say it's kind of a means-tested type thing, that if you're more well off, you're going to carry more of the burden, but if you're not as well off, you're going to end up carrying less. So it's actually going to be a good thing. And we're going to basically take the government, it's basically going to work like a Medicare Advantage type situation, where you can pick the provider that what you want to use, But in the long haul, not only will it save Medicare, it'll provide it for the next several generations, but I think that it'll make it more robust and more fair. So when people say that, we should just, tax people more, well, in essence, that's going to happen with means tested, where people that are more well off
would pay more.
They're going to carry more of the burden, right?
At the beginning of our segment, we touched on how you were able to defeat your party leader on his plan for more military jet engines to be built. Do you think we're starting to see a shift among the Republicans, kind of away from defense spending?
I don't think so. I think that, but we are looking at everything across the board when it comes to is there waste, fraud, or abuse in every area. Certainly, and I would consider myself part of it, that, we believe in small government, we believe in capitalism, we believe in the federal free market, but we also believe in a strong defense, and we believe in carrying the biggest stick on the block. Now, with the second engine and going against my speaker, which I'm afraid to even talk about right now because I'm still wondering how I pulled it off. But for me, it was definitely the arguments that we would fund 2 engines even though we would only use 1 didn't make any sense. And certainly with Pratt Whitney being here locally in Palm Beach County, could potentially mean a lot more jobs for us here. We're just hopeful that because we were able to sell to the freshmen that this is a way to shave $500 million from the budget right now, and you can go home and tell your constituents that we were able to win that argument.
I know, Congressman, you say we should still carry the biggest stick, we America, but when does it get to a point where we cannot be the caretakers of the world and we have such dire issues to deal with here at home?
It's not being the caretaker so much of the world or getting into nation building, even though that is kind of where we've been. It's just to the point where nobody messes with us. We're able to defend ourselves here and, our allies. And it's not just, for now, it's for generations to come. We've been able to be who we are and, be that shining city on the hill because of the fact that we believe in the free markets. You can live the American dream and without the fear that somebody's going to hurt us.
Very, very quickly before I let you go, your district will be one of the ones being redrawn coming up. It goes from the East Coast to the West Coast. How do you want to see it redrawn?
I'd like to see it stay the same way it is. I mean, we had pretty good, but I know that that's not going to happen. So certainly that's going to be weighed over the next several months, and we'll put our input in. But this is done by Tallahassee, not by Washington. So we can only have input, and hopefully, I'm able to keep a lot of my constituents.
Congressman Tom Rooney, thank you very much. We've waited since August, and it was worth the wait.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Coming up, our roundtable is next. Protest at a town meeting. Can we expect more? We'll talk about it after this. Now for our roundtable with News Channel 5 political analyst and coordinator of the American Studies program at Lynn University, Robert Watson, and Brian Crowley, author of the Crowley Political Report. Welcome to both of you. Okay, what do you think of what Congressman Rooney had to say? Dr. Watson, we'll start with you.
I guess the bottom line here is the congressman's a likable fellow. He's in a safe seat. District 16 is safe. He's won by big margins both times. I don't believe he even has a challenger right now, and even if there's protests that are popping up around the area, he seems so safe. I guess the one thing that struck me is that the congressman didn't really have an answer when you asked him, rightfully so, about military families and housing. If you're on the Armed Services Committee, if you're a veteran yourself, surely there's something we can do. You mean there's nothing we can do, whether it's some kind of deferment or extra loans or better housing on the base, or there's something we've got to be able to do to help all these military families across the country who are not only suffering when loved ones are deployed, but suffering trying to keep a roof over their head while serving the country.
Yeah, that's what they had said. It's a real double whammy.
It sure is.
Be hit by the housing crisis in addition to the deployments. What do you think, Brian?
Well, I agree with Robert that at this point, it doesn't look like Mr. Rooney is going to have any serious opposition. But I do think that, and he also should probably be grateful for Allen West, because for the Democrats, that's the target, and that's where they want to put their energy in this region. But it's going to be interesting to see how this Medicare issue evolves. The Democrats have finally found an issue they think they can bring home, especially in an area like South Florida, where there are so many people that are on Medicare and depend on it. And, these protests last week at various congressional offices, not only in Florida, but around the country, it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves in the weeks ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I agree completely. This You know, they always say before a big sporting event, you don't say anything irresponsible because you don't want to give your opposing team one of those newspaper clippings that they hang on the locker room wall.
Right.
I played football in college, and the coach always said, keep your mouth shut before the game. Well, I think the Republicans have just given the Democrats their newspaper clipping to hang on the locker room wall. If they can't rally around this, what can they rally around? And I did notice that the DCCC, the Democratic Campaign Committee, has bought radio ads. They're going to start running radio ads against Rooney about Medicare. But despite all that, I think you're right, Brian. I think the Democrats are better off focusing on West. I can't imagine Rooney really being seriously challenged.
All right, well, coming up next on To The Point, is it time to change the voting procedures? We're going to take a look at a proposal making its way through the Florida legislature. There is a move by the Florida legislature to change early voting from 2 weeks to 5 days. The Republicans say it's going to save money. The Democrats do not like it because they're usually favored when it comes to early voting, right?
Democrats do very well with registering and early voting. If you looked at the last election, in 2008, rather, their numbers surged because of a very concentrated effort by the Obama campaign and the Democrats in general to register college students and minorities and other groups. And they wound up with a 600,000 plus voter edge in the state. And the Republicans see this as a way of cutting back on that. It's not saving any significant amount of money for the state to cut back on early voting. And if there's one thing that we should be willing to spend money on, it should be to encourage people to vote. That's what democracy is all about.
Yeah, it's not saving money, it's saving Republican hides. This is what it's saving. Democrats are more likely to vote early. We know that. More and more people are voting early. In Palm Beach County, the numbers that were released in the 2008 presidential election, it's just over, I think, a quarter of all the votes cast were early votes. What the Republican plan does is they want to take a 2-week early voting, knock it down to 6 days. That's pretty draconian. You're going to see the lines getting longer. And I think the question has to be asked, if they're billing this as reform, what does this have to do with getting people out to vote? What does this have to do with voter awareness? What does this have to do with better designed ballots? What does this have to do with cutting down on the money that's spent on campaigns? This has nothing to do with any of that. Moreover, what is it going to do about jobs, which is what we heard folks are going to focus on.
And the other problem is that this is just a small part of their overall election reform package. I mean, they also want to make it difficult for people to volunteer to register voters. They want to. There's a proposal where volunteers have to register with the state. That if a volunteer fails to register with the state, they have to pay a fine. That names they collect to register to vote have to be turned in within 48 hours, and if not, they have to pay a fine. Yep. So, I mean, that is just craziness. And frankly, I think it'll fail in the courts. I mean, you can't throw up those kinds of those are almost Jim Crow style obstacles for people to vote. It's just
Brian's
outrageous.
Right. This is only one part of the so-called reform, giving organizations that turn in registered voters to get applications, there's less time to verify that. It's not reform. And this is why almost every supervisor of elections in the state, the League of Women Voters, almost every major nonpartisan election group is opposing this. The only people favoring it are some Republicans that are sitting in office.
Well, then voters, if they really know what's going on, I would imagine they'd be pretty angry. I mean, are they going to affect any change? That's right.
To the point. They can get the point. Well, you know, it's just one of those issues when you think about Iraq and Afghanistan and budget deficits and the royal wedding and Donald Trump's hairdo. I mean, who has time to discuss this? It's not an issue that's getting the kind of media coverage that it should be getting. And it's hard to find any credible nonpartisan organization in the country that would back something like this.
And, you know, some of the irony of this is if you look at the 2010 election, you know, under the existing rules, obviously the Republicans did extraordinarily well in this state. They wound up with supermajorities in the House and the Senate. They took over the governor's office and all of the cabinet positions. You couldn't want a better home run than that. So I'm not exactly sure what they're fighting against at this point.
Yeah, and it's also a party that has done almost nothing on election reform for decades, and all of a sudden they found election quote-unquote reform. So I think this is an obvious. It's easy to unmask this particular effort.
We'll keep the conversation going about this, and we'll be back with more in just a moment. And some final thoughts now. We'll begin with you, Dr. Watson.
Well, the voting reform isn't the only reform coming to theaters near you in Florida. The state legislature, Dean Cannon, the speaker, is pushing quote-unquote reform of the state Supreme Court, increasing from 7 to 10 justices, splitting it into 2 courts, and conveniently moving the 3 Democratic appointees to the court that wouldn't handle all the cases that are coming down. FDR tried this in 1937. It was wrong then, but court packing is wrong now.
Our Crowley closer.
Well, this is going to be the most important week of the Florida legislative session. It's the final week of the legislative session. We're going to see a lot of major changes in Florida as a result of this session, including the one that Robert was just talking about, and it's going to be a huge test for Rick Scott.
And we'll be talking about it right here on To The Point. So join us next Sunday. And if you have any comments about the show, please send them to WPTV.com. Have a terrific day.